It is a truth universally acknowledged, though perhaps less universally expressed, that the arrival of a single man in possession of a good fortune must stir the quietude of country life. And so it was in the neighborhood of Longbourn, the modest estate of the Bennet family, when Netherfield Park, grand and vacant for so long, was let at last to a Mr. Bingley, a young gentleman of considerable means from the north of England. The news threw Mrs. Bennet into a flutter of calculation and hope. Possessed of 5 daughters, the serene beauty Jane, the quick-witted Elizabeth, the studious Mary, the impressionable Kitty, and the irrepressibly giddy Lydia, and burdened by an entailment that directed the Longbourn estate away from the female line upon her husband's death, Mrs. Bennet saw in Mr. Bingley the potential salvation for at least one of her girls. Her husband, Mr. Bennet, a man of wry humor and weary detachment, observed her machinations with quiet amusement, finding refuge in his library from the ceaseless marital strategizing. The neighborhood's hopes and curiosities culminated at the Meryton Assembly Ball. Mr. Bingley proved instantly amiable, his charming manners and evident admiration for the lovely Jane Bennet winning approval from all, especially Mrs. Bennet. His party, however, included his fashionable sisters, Caroline Bingley and Mrs. Hurst, and most notably his friend, Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy. Mr. Darcy, taller and even wealthier than Bingley, possessed a countenance of stern reserve. His initial favorable impression, owing to his fine figure and reports of his 10,000 a year, soon soured. He danced little, spoke less, and his aloofness quickly hardened into perceived arrogance, particularly when he pronounced Elizabeth Bennet merely tolerable and not handsome enough to tempt him to dance, words fatefully overheard by Elizabeth herself. Her pride, already piqued by his disdainful air, was wounded, though she met the slight with characteristic spirit and wit, resolving privately to hold this proud man in contempt. In the weeks that followed, Bingley's affection for Jane deepened visibly. He was a frequent visitor at Longbourn, his attentions gentle and sincere. Jane, equally smitten but inherently reserved, returned his regard with quiet sweetness, though her composure perhaps concealed the true depth of her feelings from observers less keen than her sister Elizabeth. Darcy, meanwhile, found himself increasingly drawn to Elizabeth, much against his own judgment and inclination. He observed the lively intelligence in her expressive eyes, admired her spirited independence and the easy grace of her movements, even as he disapproved of her family's occasional lack of propriety and her own tendency towards playful impertinence. His attention manifested not in compliments, but in silent observation and occasional, terse exchanges that Elizabeth interpreted as further proof of his disagreeable pride. Further complicating Elizabeth's view of Darcy was the arrival in Meryton of the militia, and with them, a charming young officer named George Wickham. Wickham possessed an easy grace and a captivating manner that soon made him a favorite, especially with Elizabeth. He confided in her a tale of past injustice, painting Mr. Darcy as a cruel and vindictive man who, out of jealousy and spite, had denied Wickham the clerical living promised to him by Darcy's late father, leaving him penniless and adrift. This story, delivered with apparent sincerity, perfectly aligned with Elizabeth's preconceived notions of Darcy's arrogance and cemented her prejudice against him. She accepted Wickham's narrative without question, her sympathy engaged, her dislike of Darcy inflamed. The social whirl continued with an invitation to a ball at Netherfield Park. It proved an evening of mixed emotions. Bingley's devotion to Jane was unmistakable, filling Mrs. Bennet with triumphant expectation. Elizabeth, however, endured several mortifications, a pointed refusal to dance with Darcy early in the evening, followed by a reluctant acceptance later, during which their conversation was strained and barbed. She suffered further embarrassment from her mother's indiscreet boasting, Mary's awkward musical performance, and Mr. Collins's unwelcome attentions. Mr. Collins, the pompous clergyman cousin destined to inherit Longbourn, had arrived with the intention of marrying one of the Bennet daughters to heal the familial breach, his choice quickly settling on Elizabeth. Shortly after the Netherfield ball, Mr. Bingley and his entire party abruptly departed for London, with no stated plans for return. Jane was left bewildered and heartbroken, though she bore her disappointment with quiet fortitude. Elizabeth, enraged, was convinced Darcy and Bingley's sisters had conspired to separate Bingley from Jane, deeming her connections insufficiently grand. This suspicion further blackened Darcy's character in her estimation. Adding insult to injury, Mr. Collins then formally proposed marriage to Elizabeth. He delivered his offer with an air of condescending certainty, outlining the practical advantages with utter insensitivity to any notion of affection. Elizabeth refused him unequivocally, horrified by his lack of understanding and repulsed by his character. Her refusal shocked Mr. Collins and dismayed Mrs. Bennet, but Mr. Bennet supported his favorite daughter's decision. Undeterred, Mr. Collins swiftly transferred his attentions to Elizabeth's sensible friend, Charlotte Lucas, who, valuing security above romance, accepted his proposal, much to Elizabeth's astonishment and quiet disappointment in her friend's pragmatism. In the spring, Elizabeth traveled to Kent to visit the newly married Charlotte Collins at Hunsford Parsonage, situated near Rosings Park, the magnificent estate of Mr. Collins's patroness, Lady Catherine de Bourgh. Lady Catherine proved to be an imperious and domineering woman, whose condescending pronouncements and intrusive questions Elizabeth bore with polite restraint. To Elizabeth's surprise, Mr. Darcy arrived at Rosings for an extended visit, he being Lady Catherine's nephew. Thrown frequently into his company, Elizabeth observed a continued, puzzling interest in her presence. Their interactions remained laced with underlying tension. One afternoon, during her solitary walk, Darcy sought her out and, with little preamble and an air that spoke more of condescension than affection, declared his ardent admiration and love. He confessed he had struggled against his feelings, citing her inferior family connections and the impropriety of her relations as significant obstacles he had overcome only with great difficulty. Elizabeth, stunned and insulted by his manner and the content of his declaration, furiously rejected him. She accused him of ruining Jane's happiness by separating her from Bingley and of cruelly mistreating Mr. Wickham. Darcy received her accusations